Hi, this is Guy Burgess. As we've been saying in previous posts, the sort of focus of the Moving Beyond Intractability seminar series has been an exploration into the idea that conflict and intractable large-scale social conflict are complex adaptive systems and not merely complicated systems. And what this means is that dealing with intractable conflict is not like building some elaborate, complicated structure. Instead, it's like improving an ecosystem. And here we're not talking about biological ecosystems so much as social ecosystems. And the key then is to understand what are ecosystems and how do they evolve, because that's in fact how you change them. They're not designed, they're not built, nobody has control. What we're talking about is improving the way in which they evolve. Now, years ago when I was in graduate school, I had the good fortune of working with Kenneth Boulding as a graduate student when he was writing the book Ecodynamics, which I still think is one of the most remarkable books that certainly I've ever read. And what it does is it lays out an ecodynamic or ecological view of the way the universe works that governs not only the physical world and the biological world, but also the social world. And I think that offers a window into understanding the nature of these systems, at least with respect to the kind of difficult conflicts that we're talking about. Now, the core of Boulding's book is built around this notion of creation being, he called it the Kim saga, the combination of knowledge, energy, and materials, or know-how, energy, and materials. So what you have, and here the notion of know-how or information is most important, is that somehow or another you've got, and this changes over time, information that knows how to combine materials and energy to create new things. And those new things then interact in an ecosystem in ways that select for some things and not for others. So he started by saying, he suspects that ecological principles govern the evolution of the physical universe. So that happened a long time ago, and it's something that cosmologists are just starting to figure out. But the basic idea was that there was know-how embedded in the structure of matter, electrons, protons, and all the subatomic particles know how to link up with some other particles and atoms, but not others, and that again you have the set of evolutionary interactions that governed how some physical structures survived and others didn't. So the notion of evolutionary creation going way back before life still I think makes sense, but that's getting way out of the realm in which I know anything really about, so we'll put that off to the side. But we do know a lot about biological evolution, and here at the Galapagos Islands, where Charles Darwin first hit on the idea of how the phenomenal differentiation of species and the sophistication of life emerged. And here what you've got is the same sort of thing, the combination of know-how, energy, and materials, but in the biological world, know-how is embodied in DNA, biogenetics. The formula of life knew how to construct a wide range of plants and animals based on their genetic makeup. And that again led to interactions in the ecosystem, and some survived and others didn't, and it produced all sorts of populations in the phenomenal world that we know now. Now, the thing about biological know-how that I think is so remarkable is that an awful lot of it is instinctual, and a lot of it is encoded in DNA. There are, and we spend a lot of time bird watching, there are birds that do phenomenal things. There's one that nests in northern Great Britain, flies without landing all the way around Antarctica and flies back to the same spot. It knows how to do that because of instincts that are embedded in DNA. It didn't go to school. It didn't go to navigation class. It can't read the stars, but somehow it can do it. So in the biological world, instinctual learning is prominent. Learned learning, plants and animals, especially animals, can sense the environment around them. They can learn a lot. They get very clever. So it's not like that kind of learning doesn't exist. It's just not as dominant as the instinctual based learning. And then you get the whole range of ecological interactions that occur with all of these individuals that are driven by DNA. And this is the list of all the different kinds of relationships that I got off Wikipedia. But basically, you have a long-term drive towards increasing specialization wherever there's a niche that some plant or animal can figure out how to survive, it'll take that. This is a picture of spring beauty. It's a flower that only grows on top of the highest peaks in Colorado. And it has a very long root, so it can actually grow in boulder fields where there isn't any soil for 5-10 feet underground, but it still survives. And it's that kind of specialization and creativity that comes out of biological ecodynamics. You can trace this way back really to the beginning of sort of cellular life. You have the explosion of life that occurred in Cambrian times and the 500 million years since then. And that takes us to now, and if we look sort of at the world that has evolved, it's truly awe-inspiring. The other thing that's key is that unlike a complicated system or the physical world where atoms do the same thing every time, here in the biological world, individuals, and there are multitudes and multitudes of these individuals, are all pursuing their own self-interest based on instincts and their perceptions around them. So what you have is this process of perception and decision-making that's driving behavior that produces a vastly different kind of world. Now, the evolution of this has been very, very slow. As I say, it's been 500 years since the sort of higher forms of life started to emerge. And the process of innovation, that is, the mutations that lead to just variations on species and ultimately to new species and allow plants and animals to try to adapt to new niches, has been very, very slow and very local. And things have to be proven and last often for millions of years in a local area before they can spread around the planet. And this process has sort of by any reasonable definition produced, the intelligent evolution of life. Maybe not the supreme being, but in a sense you're building off the intelligence of everything that ever lived. And the result is at least the biosphere as we saw it before humans started to evolve, and in some reasonably, it's certainly reasonable to say that humans have started to destroy this. There's certainly reason to believe that we're going to be as big of an extinction event as the comet that did in the dinosaurs. So then Boulding goes on to say, okay, now with the advent of human society, set evolution off on a whole new track. It's not that these other forms of physical and biological evolution didn't continue, but human evolution is something very different. And so go back to his original sort of formula, we add a different kind of know-how. That's human learning, what he called new genetics. So you now can figure things out, you can engage in the scientific method, you can engage in philosophizing, you can teach, you can pool knowledge from countless individuals. Quincy Wright identified sort of 4 stages in the evolution of human know-how, where we sort of first emerge with special human traits with language and the ability to communicate sophisticated symbolic ideas between individuals, tell stories that allowed those ideas to persist over time, and people could remember. You could spread it out over small areas. The next big revolution was writing, which allowed ideas to really be extended over time and space. In a very real sense, it made large-scale empires possible. The printing press, Gutenberg, made writing and books cheap enough that we could start to have universal literacy, and with the opportunity for the explosion of learning that made possible. And we now have digital information, and where that's going is still very much unknown, but I know that I have on my hip and a cute little cell phone probably easier access to more information than the university's entire library when I was just an undergraduate student. So think about it. It took 500 million years from the Cambrian explosion to now, and in the space of a few thousand years, humans have gone from the most primitive of tool makers, chipping arrowheads off rocks, to the modern world. And that's an astonishingly fast accomplishment. So what we've done is we've added to Charles Darwin biological evolution, a whole set of knowledge about social competitive interactions. Here, Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations is maybe the most prominent example, but there's obviously much, much more. The other thing that the advent of human society has done is it has added to the sort of biological ecodynamics and relationships a whole series of other peculiarly human types of interaction. Now, the three that Boulding highlighted in his book, The Three Faces of Power, I think again illustrate how exceptionally different people are. And certainly animals threaten one another with competition for territory and certainly the threat of predation. But you don't have threat in the same way that you have with humans. You do something I want and essentially enslave or oppress somebody, or I'll do something that you don't want. That takes a kind of symbolic reasoning that I think there might be a sort of exception somewhere, but that's something the simple biological world just can't do. We also have exchange, and there's symbiotic relationships in the biological world, but nothing like economies, nothing like mediums of exchange and very complex sort of consciously agreed on relationships for mutual assistance. Also in the animal world, you certainly have love in the sense of parents caring for their offspring, and herds sort of protecting one another and that sort of thing. But nothing like the really large-scale love-hate relationships that you get with the human world. So we're adding other forms of interaction, but it's still basically a set of competitive ecological interactions. Now, the other thing that is really important about this is that the speed of the evolution of the sociosphere, the human society, is astonishingly fast. So I say in the space of a few thousand years, we've gone from chipping stones to the modern world. And if you look at what's projected for just the next few years as computers get to be as smart as people, it's absolutely jaw-dropping. The problem is that when you have ideas that disseminate globally virtually instantly, bad ideas can infect the whole planet in catastrophic ways. And the big question is whether or not we're up to governing the global commons in a way that produces the kind of world we want to live in. Another fundamental principle about ecodynamics is ecosystems don't care. So here, this is a picture of the Great Yellowstone fires, which were absolutely devastating. In some areas, the fires got so hot that it pretty much sterilized everything. But here's a case where, in the space of a few short months, you had fireweed coming in and taking advantage of the fact that all the lodgepole trees were gone. So for every sort of catastrophe, there will be beneficiaries. So there's not really a sense in which you make the whole ecosystem better, except this notion of the tragedy of the commons, where you have cases where individuals pursuing their own self-interest can so destroy the common ecosystem on which everyone depends that the results are catastrophic for pretty much everybody. And in a sense, what we need to do is to govern the planet in ways that avoid that. So now we're looking at the continuation of geologic history, except this time with humans. Now you can look backwards and say this is the Anthropocene, the era in which humans came and caused this great mass extinction and pretty much ruined everything. And you can make that argument, and it's fairly persuasive in many ways, but it's also the dawn of what you might call the Anthropocene era. So humans, the invention of human knowledge, is as big a thing to happen to the planet as DNA. It's a whole new form of information, a whole new kind of evolution. And the deal is that we get to decide where it all goes. We can have, again, the kind of ecological competition that produces, here to borrow a metaphor from Adam Smith, we could guide things in a way where we have an invisible hand, where competition in the social world guides things in a way that benefits everyone. Or we could let power over oppression take over and have the invisible fist, in which a few dominate everyone else to the aggregate detriment of the planet. And it's basically a choice of where we're going, and the key is that our ability to deal with conflict is going to be crucial in determining where we go. And if you want to sort of, just a little bit more of a push, here's a kind of dismal article that's been making the rounds lately, that humans could be extinct within 100 years if we don't get a handle on this stuff. So some questions. What do you see as the most promising strategies for promoting power with efforts to govern the commons in ways that advance the common good? And what do you see as promising strategies for promoting a more enlightened view of self-interest, one that focuses on protecting the commons and avoiding the kind of devastating "I'll fight you for it" conflicts